A trail camera was never supposed to capture this. Mounted on a cypress trunk in the heart of the Everglades, it was built to record motion, log activity, and stay silent for weeks at a time. Nobody expected the file that came back. On the footage, a bobcat barely a quarter the size of its target is seen dragging the headless body of a 52-pound Burmese python through the mud, claiming it like a trophy. For 20 years, nothing in this swamp had dared to do that. Something has changed in the Everglades, and almost nobody outside a small circle of biologists has noticed it yet. To understand what that footage means, you have to go back to a night in August of 1992, when Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida with winds strong enough to flatten entire neighborhoods. Somewhere in the chaos, a reptile breeding facility lost its walls, and an unknown number of Burmese pythons slipped into the dark, into the canals, into the sawgrass, and into a swamp that had no idea what was coming. At almost the same time, hundreds of exotic pet owners across the state were quietly making a decision that would outlast the hurricane by decades. They had bought baby pythons as novelty pets, watched them grow into 12-foot animals too large for a suburban home, and instead of facing that mistake, they drove to the edge of the Everglades and let the snake go. They believed they were giving it freedom. What they were actually doing was loading a weapon and leaving it in a city with no immune system to stop it. Here is where the story gets uncomfortable, because the Everglades wasn't just a hiding place for these snakes. It was practically built for them. Over 1.5 million acres of warm, humid wetland, year-round prey, and not a single native predator that had ever seen anything like a Burmese python before. Raccoons, opossums, marsh rabbits, and deer had spent thousands of years learning to fear alligators, bobcats, and panthers. None of them had a single instinct wired for an ambush predator that could grow past 15 feet, sense body heat in pitch darkness, sit motionless in 2 inches of water for hours, and strike before the brain even registered movement. Florida wildlife officials have been blunt about what this meant in practice. Every python loose in the swamp was directly stealing the food supply of the state's actual native predators, leaving alligators, panthers, and bobcats hunting in a landscape that had quietly been emptied out around them. And the numbers back this up in a way that should genuinely unsettle anyone who has spent time in the Everglades before and after. Estimates for how many Burmese pythons now live in South Florida range from at least 30,000 to more than 300,000, a gap so enormous it tells you something on its own. Nobody actually knows, because even experienced herpetologists searching for pythons in controlled, semi-natural conditions only manage to detect about 1% of the animals that are actually present. Imagine trying to fight a war where you can only see 1 out of every 100 soldiers on the other side. That is not an exaggeration. That is the literal operating condition Florida's wildlife agencies have been working under for over 2 decades. And it is the reason this invasion has been so difficult to even measure, let alone reverse. For years, the state's main public response was something almost theatrical in its scale compared to the problem: an annual hunting competition called the Florida Python Challenge, where hundreds of people would head into the swamp for 10 days hoping to make a dent. But here's where the story takes its first real turn, because last year's challenge actually broke records in a way that nobody fully expected. In the 2025 Florida Python Challenge, 934 participants from 30 states and Canada collectively removed a record 294 invasive Burmese pythons from South Florida, nearly 50% more than the year before. A 4'11" woman from Naples named Taylor Stanberry walked away with the $10,000 grand prize after personally removing 60 pythons, some of them 3 times her own size. It made headlines, it made for great television, and it genuinely mattered for awareness. But read the numbers again. 294 animals removed, against a population that could be in the hundreds of thousands. That single fact tells you more about the true scale of this crisis than almost anything else in this story. So, if the public hunt isn't the real weapon, what is? This is where the story shifts from spectacle to something far more clinical and far more effective. Florida's professional removal teams don't wait for a 10-day window once a year. They work the swamp constantly, and the acceleration in their results over the past 12 months has been staggering. Between May and July of 2025 alone, the state's Python Action Team removed 1,022 pythons, compared to just 343 during that same window the year before. A near tripling of the kill rate in a single season. Think about what that means. It isn't just that hunters are getting better. It means the state finally found a method that works, and once they found it, the results exploded almost overnight. That method has a name, and it is almost unsettling in its simplicity. Researchers surgically implant GPS trackers into adult male pythons during breeding season, then release them back into the swamp and let the snake do the hunting for them. A tagged male will instinctively travel toward the largest, most reproductively active females in the area, and when he gets there, the removal team is waiting. This is not theory. This is documented, working strategy, and the most recent results from it are almost hard to believe. Between November 2025 and April 2026, researchers using the scout snake method removed 177 pythons, weighing a combined 8,080 pounds, from a 200 square mile stretch of Collier County, the program's first 4-ton removal season ever recorded. And the targets weren't random. Biologists focused specifically on pregnant females, each one carrying an average of 70 eggs while weighing close to 95 pounds. Do the arithmetic on that for a second. Every single one of those females removed, before laying her clutches potentially 70 future pythons that simply never exist. This is not a hunt anymore. This is a calculated surgical strike against the invasion's reproductive engine, and for the first time in over 2 decades, the math is actually starting to bend in Florida's favor. But here's where the story stops being only about human effort, because something else has been happening in the swamp that nobody planned, nobody trained, and nobody fully predicted. Remember that bobcat from the opening. It wasn't an isolated event. Wildlife officials and conservation groups have now documented multiple cases of native predators actively hunting pythons rather than avoiding them, something that simply did not happen in the early years of the invasion. Florida panthers, one of the most endangered big cats on the planet with fewer than 200 individuals left in the wild, have been filmed stalking pythons through dense palmetto thickets for 20 minutes before striking. Alligators have been documented both eating juvenile pythons and, in some cases, losing fights to larger ones, which tells you this is now a genuine contest rather than a one-sided massacre. Read that again. After 20 years of total dominance, the apex predator of the Everglades is, for the first time, taking real losses. Why now, after so long? The leading theory among biologists is also the most uncomfortable one to sit with. Native predators are learning, not evolving in the genetic sense, learning the way an individual animal adapts its behavior based on experience. A python that has just eaten a large meal becomes sluggish and metabolically slow for days, leaving it vulnerable in a way it never is while hunting. A python in cooler winter temperatures moves at a fraction of its normal speed, and a python's skull, for all its menace, is proportionally fragile compared to the rest of its body, which means a predator fast enough to strike the head before the snake can react can end the fight before it really begins. Florida's native wildlife isn't winning this war yet, but for the first time since 1992, it is no longer simply losing it either. And if that were the entire story, it would already be remarkable. But here is where everything changes, because the python was never traveling alone. Hidden inside its body the entire time was a second invader, one that has turned out to be even harder to stop than the snake that carried it. While studying sick native snakes across the state, researchers began noticing something deeply wrong. Garter snakes, pygmy rattlesnakes, and other native species were turning up emaciated, weak, and struggling to breathe, their mouths open in visible respiratory distress. When biologists examined them, they found their lungs packed with small, pale, worm-like organisms still alive and moving. The parasite is called Rhylietiella orientalis, a lungworm that evolved alongside Burmese pythons in Southeast Asia for millions of years, which is exactly why it barely harms the pythons themselves. Florida's native snakes have no such history with it. Their immune systems have never seen anything like it before, and the difference in outcome is brutal. The transmission path is what makes this almost impossible to contain, because it doesn't depend on direct contact with a python at all anymore. An infected python sheds parasite larvae through its waste. Cockroaches, which are everywhere in the Everglades, consume that waste and pick up the larvae. A native frog eats the cockroach. A native snake eats the frog. This is simply how the food chain has always worked in this ecosystem. Except now, every single link in that ordinary chain is a potential infection event. Once inside a snake, the larvae burrow through the stomach wall, migrate into the lungs, and anchor there, feeding and multiplying until the airways fill and the animal slowly suffocates. And the spread has been anything but slow. The parasite was first identified in Florida in 2012, and within roughly a decade had already spread to 14 confirmed counties, with some more recent assessments placing the number even higher, closer to 24. At least 19 of Florida's native snake species are now confirmed infected, and researchers say the disease is poised to spread throughout the entire southeastern United States. Now here's the detail that should genuinely concern anyone paying attention. This is no longer a python problem. Researchers have confirmed that the parasite has completed what's called a host shift, meaning it no longer needs a single Burmese python anywhere nearby to keep spreading. It is cycling entirely through cockroaches, frogs, and native snakes on its own, independent of the species that originally brought it here. Think about what that actually means for a second. Even in the impossible scenario where every Burmese python in Florida vanished overnight, this parasite would remain exactly where it is, spreading exactly as it has been, completely unaffected by the python's removal. And right now, there is no cure. There is currently no treatment or fix for the disease, which is why researchers have had to resort to something almost desperately low-tech, asking ordinary members of the public to report sightings of sick or dead snakes through photos on social media, email, and citizen science apps like iNaturalist, because right now, crowdsourced observation is genuinely one of the only tracking tools they have. So Florida is now fighting on two fronts at once, and they are not the same fight. One enemy is large, visible, and slowly being beaten back by sharper trapping science, and native predators finally fighting back. The other is microscopic, already self-sustaining, already established across a quarter of the state's counties, and currently has no known solution. This is not chaos. This is two separate, simultaneous collapses happening to the same ecosystem from two completely different directions. One eating it from the top of the food chain down, and one rotting it from the inside out. But in the middle of all that bad news, there is one piece of this story that genuinely deserves to be called hopeful, and it has almost nothing to do with pythons at all. Long before any snake escaped during Hurricane Andrew, Florida had already lost one of its most important native predators to something far more mundane: habitat destruction. The eastern indigo snake, the longest native snake species in North America, with scales so deeply black they shimmer blue in direct sunlight, used to range across the entire southeastern United States. It depends almost entirely on gopher tortoise burrows for shelter, and when Florida's development boom wiped out the long-leaf pine forests those tortoises need, the indigo snake disappeared right along with them. By the late 1970s, this species, one of the only snakes in North America with a near-total natural immunity to pit viper venom, capable of overpowering and eating rattlesnakes and cottonmouths whole, was functionally extinct across most of North Florida. For nearly a decade now, a coalition of conservation groups has been working to bring it back, and the most recent chapter of that effort happened only weeks before this very script was written. In late April and early May of 2026, conservation teams released a total of 42 juvenile eastern indigo snakes, 21 at the Nature Conservancy's Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, and another 21 into Conecuh National Forest in Alabama, marking the 10th consecutive year of releases at that Florida preserve since the program began in 2017. That brings the total number of captive-bred eastern indigo snakes reintroduced into that single preserve to well over 200 individuals. And the reason this matters so much more than just a release number is what happened back in 2023, when researchers discovered something they had been hoping for years. 2 wild-born eastern indigo snake hatchlings were found at the same preserve. Not released animals, not lab-raised juveniles, but snakes that had been conceived, hatched, and were surviving entirely on their own in the wild for the first time in over 40 years. Think about the timeline here, because it matters. The eastern indigo snake vanished from this part of Florida around 1982. For roughly 4 decades, it simply wasn't there. And now, through nearly 10 straight years of methodical habitat restoration and careful breeding, it isn't just back, it's reproducing without any human involvement at all. Conservation biologists involved in the project have described this as the single clearest signal that a reintroduction effort is actually working, because a population that breeds on its own no longer depends on a constant supply of captive-bred animals to survive. It has crossed the line from a managed experiment into something closer to a real, self-sustaining wild population. So why does an indigo snake matter to a story about pythons and parasites? Because this particular species happens to be one of the very few native predators in the entire ecosystem that is large enough, strong enough, and aggressive enough to realistically prey on juvenile Burmese pythons. A small python, 3 or 4 feet long, falls squarely within the size range an adult eastern indigo could overpower and swallow. That doesn't mean indigo snakes are about to single-handedly solve Florida's invasion. A fully grown 15-foot python weighing over 150 pounds is an entirely different equation, and no researcher has ever actually documented that specific encounter in the wild. Nobody knows for certain what happens if the two ever meet at that scale. But every single juvenile python that doesn't survive long enough to reach reproductive age is one less breeding adult contributing eggs to the population years down the line. And that is exactly the kind of leverage point Florida desperately needs. And yet, even this piece of good news carries a shadow that nobody can fully answer yet. Remember the lungworm, the parasite already confirmed in at least 19 native snake species and spreading independently of the pythons that introduced it. Nobody has yet confirmed whether it can infect an eastern indigo snake. The indigo's resistance to pit viper venom is a specific, narrow biological trait tied to its blood chemistry, and there is no scientific reason to assume that same trait offers any protection at all against a completely unrelated parasite that attacks the lungs rather than the bloodstream. If this disease reaches the indigo population before it grows large enough to sustain itself against losses, it could quietly undo nearly a decade of restoration work before anyone even realizes it's happening. That is the kind of risk that doesn't show up in a press release. It only shows up later, in the silence of a survey that suddenly comes back empty. What all of this adds up to is a swamp caught in the middle of three separate overlapping timelines that nobody fully controls. The python population is finally being hunted with a method precise enough to actually matter, with tens of thousands of pounds of breeding females removed in a single season for the first time in the program's history. The native predators that were nearly wiped out by this invasion are, for the first time in 20 years, beginning to fight back on their own terms, learning to recognize and exploit weaknesses that simply didn't exist for them before. And underneath all of it, a parasite nobody planned for has already established itself permanently. Independent of the species that brought it, spreading county by county with no known cure and no way to be removed, even if the original invader vanished tomorrow. Every piece of this story is currently moving at once, and none of the outcomes are settled. Will the scout snake removal program scale fast enough to actually shrink the python population? Or will it simply keep pace with reproduction the way it has for the last 2 decades? Will Florida's native predators continue adapting? Or was that bobcat footage an exception rather than the beginning of a real shift? Can the eastern indigo snake population grow large enough, fast enough, to put real pressure on juvenile pythons before the lungworm finds a way into its lungs first? And if the parasite does reach it, is there anything anyone can actually do to stop it, given that there is currently no treatment for a disease that has already proven it doesn't need its original host to survive? Nobody currently working in the Everglades can answer those questions with any certainty, and that uncertainty is the most honest place this story can end. What's happening in that swamp right now isn't a finished battle with a clear winner. It's an active, unresolved collision between an invasion that refuses to stop reproducing, a hidden parasite that has already outgrown the animal that introduced it, and a native species clawing its way back from the edge of extinction at the worst possible moment to need a perfect outcome. The cameras are still rolling out there in the cypress and the sawgrass, and whatever they capture next may end up mattering more than anyone watching right now even realizes.